idea of a state for the Jewish people had begun to gain traction by the end of the First World War. This was formalized by the 1917 Balfour Declaration from the British government, which proclaimed the intention of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. I'm your host, David, and today we will be talking about the creation of the State of Israel. This is the Cold War. Although the British troops occupied Palestine in 1918 following the campaign against the Ottomans, the League of Nations made this annexation legitimate in 1922 by granting the mandate over Palestine to Britain. The mandate included provisions calling for the establishment of a Jewish homeland, facilitating Jewish immigration, and encouraging Jewish settlement on the land. Of course, as you might already know, the Arab population in Palestine was opposed to the increase in Jewish immigration and settlement. This became the source of a great deal of conflict and confrontation prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, which the British were unable to stop. Over 250,000 Jews arrived in Palestine between 1929 and 1938, and despite the efforts of the British to prevent this immigration, the Jewish Agency, as well as other Jewish organizations, continued to help smuggle Jews into Palestine. In the Palestinian Mandate, armed Jewish organizations were fighting against both Arab groups and the British administration. Their goal was to ensure continued Jewish immigration and, ultimately, independence. If you're wondering why immigration was considered so vital to the Jewish community, you just need to recall that the persecution of Jews across much of Europe was widespread in the pre-war years, with many nations unwilling to accept Jewish refugees. The idea of a partition in Palestine was first presented by the British Peel Commission in 1937, after it became clear that there was little chance of achieving order in Palestine. The Peel Commission proposed the creation of two separate states, one Arab and one Jewish, with population transfers happening to adjust ethnic divides. The Jewish community was in favor of this proposal, seeing it as a first step in the creation of a Jewish homeland, but the Arab community opposed it, as they did not want to lose the land. The other prominent proposal made by the British government in the pre-Second World War era was the White Paper, published in 1939. It called for the establishment of a Jewish national home inside of an independent Palestine within the next 10 years. It also put a limit on Jewish immigration to a maximum of 75,000 people over 5 years. And finally, it placed restrictions on the Jewish population from buying more land in Palestine. While the more moderate groups in the Arab community were willing to accept this proposal, under pressure from the conservative and nationalist Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, it was eventually rejected. The Zionist groups in the Jewish community were also against the White Paper, as it did not promise an independent state for the Jews, and also imposed restrictions to immigration. The rejection led to further animosity between the Jewish community in Palestine and the British administration. British opposition to Jewish migration to Palestine, still in line with the White Paper, continued in 1945, after the end of the war. U.S. President Harry Truman asked Great Britain to admit 100,000 survivors of the Holocaust, which was subsequently rejected. The presence of a very strong U.S. Jewish political lobby, as well as favorable, some would actually very much say guilty, public opinion towards the Jewish community in the wake of the Holocaust, caused the U.S. to put a great deal of pressure on Britain to change their stance. Britain, financially dependent on the United States for rebuilding of the country, was in a very difficult position. 1946 saw the British yield somewhat with the creation of the Anglo-American Committee, focused on the issues of immigration of European Jews to Palestine, but also pointedly ignored the issue of creating an independent Jewish state. The plan was to deal with the pressing humanitarian issue and to leave the statehood issue alone so as to avoid conflict with the Arab communities, both in Palestine as well as in the region overall. By April of 1946, the committee had reached the unanimous decision for the immediate admission of 100,000 Jewish refugees from Europe in Palestine, as well as to remove the white paper restrictions on the purchase of land by Jews. So, how well was this received by both sides? If you guessed not well, you would be correct. The Arabs were not happy with the influx of more Jewish refugees who would continue to take land and resources. There were even calls in the Arab world for jihad, and for the Jews to be removed, which in this case translated to mean annihilated. The Jewish community, on the other hand, didn't like the proposal either, as it ignored the call for a Jewish state to be created. There were claims that it was an attempt to, quote-unquote, clip the wings of political Zionism by treating the whole matter as a Jewish refugee problem. So, yeah, the Commission's proposal was rejected by both sides. While all this was going on, there were armed Jewish underground organizations, such as the Haganah, Irgun, and Stern Gang, who were waging a guerrilla war against the British administration in Palestine. The guerrilla war was only intensifying the longer a settlement failed to be achieved. The British responded with the not-so-subtle Operation Agatha, the arrest of approximately 2,700 Jewish activists. This was done to disrupt Jewish paramilitary operations by seizing weapons and removing leadership. On the 21st of July, 1946, the British military headquarters, based in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, was bombed by Irgun, resulting in 91 deaths. In response to this, over 120,000 Jews were summoned and interrogated by the police. This was almost 1 out of every 5 Jews in Palestine. The heavy-handed response of the British and their inability to find a compromise, as well as the escalating violence, did not play well in the United States. The Americans put pressure on Britain and effectively forced them to refer the matter to the United Nations. In May of 1947, the United Nations formed a Special Committee on Palestine, tasked with preparing recommendations for the future of Palestine, including how it should be governed, as well as how to handle the Jewish population in the Mandate. The committee was comprised of the so-called neutral states of Australia, the Netherlands, Iran, Sweden, India, Peru, Czechoslovakia, Guatemala, Uruguay, and Yugoslavia. As you can probably guess, not all of these countries were really and truly neutral. While the Jewish Agency cooperated with the committee, the Arab leadership in Palestine boycotted any participation, claiming that the committee was pro-Zionist. The committee representatives, in the course of their considerations, carried out field trips to meet with Jewish representatives in Palestine, as well as with Arab leadership, both inside Palestine, as well as in other countries in the region. They also spent time monitoring the attempts of Jewish people attempting to illegally immigrate into Palestine, as well as meeting with Jewish refugees who were still in various holding camps across Europe. The committee, as I'm sure you could expect, was heavily lobbied by representatives from all sides, Jewish, Arab, and even the British. Jewish groups wanted a partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. The Arabs lobbied against this outcome, warning that a divided Palestine could lead to a catastrophe in the region. The British, on the other hand, lobbied in favor of partition as the only feasible option. On September 3, 1947, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine published its report. It proposed the establishment of 2 separate nations, one Arab and one Jewish, but that would retain an economic union. Jerusalem would be governed by the international community. The proposal was sent to the United Nations General Assembly to be voted on. Notably, both the United States and the Soviet Union were in favor of the proposal for partition. How well did the newly emerged superpowers view this proposal, and how did they react to it? Pro-Zionist movements in the United States had launched an intense lobbying campaign to secure public support for the plan, and to encourage the U.S. government to apply pressure on other countries to also back the proposal. President Truman, not personally happy with the lobbying taking place, still put his support behind the plan, mostly as a result of electoral considerations, with a presidential election approaching. A formal endorsement was given on October 11, 1947, and was followed by a statement signed by 26 of the U.S. senators who wielded influence on foreign aid bills, calling on other states to support the plan. Nobody should be surprised that the United States, who was so busy financing the reconstruction of a war-torn world, was using its financial muscle to get countries to do what it wanted. It's reported that at least France, Haiti, the Philippines, and Liberia voted in favor of the UN partition plan based on financial pressure from the US. Okay, so now we know why and how the Americans were in favor of the partition of Palestine. So why were the Soviets? While official Soviet ideology was critical of Zionism, describing it as a bourgeois nationalism, Stalin, forever the calculating pragmatist, chose not to see this matter through the lens of ideology, but rather as someone looking for the best geopolitical outcome for his country. The Soviet leadership saw the Arab countries as being pro-British, and hoped that the creation of a Jewish state in the region would disrupt British dominance. Stalin also hoped that the future Jewish state would be socialist in nature and align itself with the Soviet Union. With this in mind, Moscow pushed its socialist allies to support the partition plan in the UN General Assembly. As the plan required a two-thirds majority vote to succeed, the support of the Moscow-led socialist countries was crucial. Andrei Gromyko, now the Soviet ambassador to the UN, made an impassioned speech before the vote was held, calling for an independent Jewish state. He called back to the immense suffering that the Jewish people had endured through the Holocaust in order to justify Soviet support. As a side note, Soviet support for the Jewish state continued even after the Declaration of Independence of Israel, and many of the weapons used by the Israelis in the First Arab-Israeli War originated from the Skoda factories in Czechoslovakia, sold to the Jewish state under Soviet auspices. We're going to cover more about this conflict in upcoming episodes, so make sure to check it out. So, this all looks pretty favorable for the Jewish community in Palestine, but how did the Arabs feel about all this? This was, after all, their land. As I'm sure you already know, or at least can guess, they were diametrically opposed. Arab leaders applied pressure of their own in the international community to vote against the plan. The Iraqi Prime Minister warned, using very harsh language, that recognition of the plan would lead to a revolt by the Arabs of not only Palestine, but in other nations as well, and would create a great danger to the Jewish communities across the entire region. The head of the Egyptian delegation in the General Assembly echoed these warnings, warning of an inevitable bloodshed and danger to 1 million Jews living in the Arab countries. In our next episode, we'll talk more about the Arab countries in this period. The vote on the partition plan was held in the United Nations General Assembly on the 27th of November, 1947. 33 countries, including the United States and the Soviet Union, voted in favor, while only 13, almost all Muslim-majority countries, voted against the plan. The plan for the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state was passed through the United Nations. This marked the first major test of the United Nations of an extremely complicated matter, which was